Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard had a real talent for ruining your day, or perhaps even your life, in the best possible way. Anxiety, dread, existential angst, perfect reading material for a cozy afternoon, right? His 1849 book, The Sickness Unto Death, is no exception, as it is a book about despair. What it is, where it comes from, and what, if anything at all, we can do about it. Now, full disclaimer, if you have seen any of the other videos on our channel on Kierkegaard, you know that he writes from a deeply Christian existentialist perspective. Theology and philosophy are mostly intertwined in his writing, but even if you're not religious, like myself, I do find that a lot of his work still holds a lot of value. So in this video, I'll be translating some parts of his philosophy in more general terms. Know that I'm not dismissing the spiritual or religious side of his philosophy, I'm just trying to make the book more accessible for your reading. And of course, as always, know that this video is just a starting point. Kierkegaard's work is very complex and worth struggling through on your own. I won't cover everything, so after you're done here, read the book yourself. Hopefully, after watching this video, you will be brave enough to attempt just that. Let's start with the title. The full title of the book is The Sickness Unto Death, a Christian psychological exposition for upbuilding and awakening. With a title like that, you know this wasn't meant for beach reading. It sounds like something Jordan Peterson would assign you after diagnosing your existential crisis, which is exactly why I love it. It's easily his best book title out of all of his work. The book explores the concept of despair, which Kierkegaard equates with the Christian concept of sin. Kierkegaard uses the term sickness as a metaphor to describe despair, a state of unease and dissatisfaction with oneself. This sickness is not a physical disease, but a spiritual one, stemming from a lack of self-awareness, or a refusal to embrace one's true self. The unto death part signifies that this despair is a persistent, unresolved condition. It is a sickness from which one cannot escape through physical death, because the despair itself is a state of not being able to truly die, or be liberated from oneself. In the preface of the book, Kierkegaard mentions the Gospel of John, in which Christ raises Lazarus from the dead. Christ teaches us that physical death is not the end of life. Whereas sickness, death and earthly suffering may seem awful to non-Christians, to Christians they are but temporary inconveniences on the way to salvation. Those who are religious, however, must face a deeper fear than the fear of death itself. They may fear that their faith is not sufficient to bring them eternal life. This deeper fear is the true sickness unto death. The introduction expands on the themes of the preface, offering some suggestion of what Kierkegaard means by despair, as well as an explanation of how Kierkegaard interprets Christ's teaching of the resurrection. According to Kierkegaard, this knowledge frees him from the earthly cares and concerns that afflict non-believers. However, just as it makes them aware of the possibility of eternal happiness, it also makes them aware of a deeper unhappiness or despair. They may worry that their faith in God is not strong enough to bring them eternal life. This relationship between Christianity and despair is a good example, as we also find it in other of his works, such as Fear and Trembling, in which Abraham fears not just the loss of his son, but the absurd weight of trusting a God who seems to demand the impossible. Another good example Kierkegaard offers is that of the balance between happiness and unhappiness. A pagan or non-believer, for example, enjoys earthly pleasures that are balanced by the earthly fear of sickness and death. The Christian, however, enjoys a higher spiritual pleasure, including anticipation of eternal life. But these higher pleasures bring about a higher fear, the fear that one will suffer an eternal death, not being able to enjoy the eternal pleasures promised. So yeah, all of this might sound a bit heavy and probably very abstract and theoretical, but it does set the tone for what Kierkegaard is really getting at in this book, which is to navigate not only what this despair is, but also why he thinks we're all infected by it, whether we realize it or not. And that's exactly what we'll unpack next, as we take a closer look at the first main chapter of the book, titled, very reassuringly, The Sickness Unto Death is Despair. To understand what despair is, Kierkegaard first tackles what it means to be a self. He famously defines a human being as a synthesis of opposites. We are both finite and infinite, physical and spiritual, temporal and eternal. The self, he says, is essentially a relation between these parts, and more precisely, the self is a relation which relates itself to itself. In less abstract terminology, we are self-conscious beings. We can take a step back and reflect on ourselves. We can ask questions like, why am I here? Or what does this all mean? We notice our own flaws and imagine futures that might seem hopeless. This ability to reflect has allowed humans to think up amazing things, but it also makes despair a possibility. Despair shows that something is out of balance in how we see ourselves or our place in the world. It can be very painful, but it also points to the parts of our life that need attention or change. Kierkegaard insists despair is universal. You might not even realize you're in despair yourself. He outlines a kind of despair spectrum or hierarchy, ranging from a subtle, unknowing despair to a full-blown defined despair. He identifies 3 forms of despair, defined by how conscious one is of their self and their condition. The first form he calls unconscious despair, or ignorance of the self. This is not even knowing you're in despair. Kierkegaard calls this despair born of ignorance. You have no self, in the higher sense, so you don't even realize anything is wrong. Think of it like a character in the Matrix, who doesn't even realize the Matrix exists. Ignorance is bliss, but it's still not reality. The second form is despair of not wanting to be oneself. Here, you sense that something is off. You're aware you have a self, but you hate or flee from who you truly are. Kierkegaard describes this as refusing to accept oneself beyond the immediate surface level life. It's the person who says, nope, I don't like myself. I want to be someone else, or lose myself in work or in pleasure, so I never have to confront deeper truths. You might distract yourself with endless possibilities, material success, to avoid that uncomfortable self-awareness. Anything to not face the real self. This despair is likened to bad faith, a term later used by Sartre, basically living in a constant state of denial. The third and final form of despair he calls despair of defiance, or demonic despair. This is the most intense form of despair. Here, you know who you are at some level, but you refuse to depend on anything else. It's a defiant pride, wanting to be the master of your own identity, come hell or high water. Kierkegaard calls this the demonic form of despair, because the self in this state says, yes, I have an eternal aspect, I have a deeper self, but I will define it myself, without any higher power telling me who I should be. Ironically, this person does want to be a self, but only on their own stubborn terms, cut off from the source of their being. Kierkegaard sees this as the most conscious and tormented form of despair. He even illustrates it with a vivid image, that of a defiant person that clings to their misery. They'd rather rage and feel wronged by the whole world than be helped. The very idea of being helped infuriates them, because their despair has become a proud possession. And not being in despair would actually be detrimental to their own sense of self, a betrayal of the self they've built in opposition to everything else. All of these forms of despair aside, Kierkegaard's entire point could be summarized as that being able to despair is part of what makes us human. Animals can't despair because they're not self-aware. In a strange way, despair is a luxury of our own human fabric. He writes that the possibility of despair is man's advantage over beasts. Yet, to actually be in despair is a terrible misfortune. And with that, we end the first part of this video series on Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death. In the next part of the book, things shift. Kierkegaard brings God fully into the picture, and that changes everything, or at least it should. Despair becomes sin, and fate. Well, fate becomes the only real way out. If you want to follow along as we keep digging into this weird and heavy, but simultaneously beautiful book, feel free to stick around. Subscribe to our channel if you want more philosophy. Or don't. Kierkegaard probably wouldn't care either way, but we'd like it. Thanks for watching. Take care.